You were honest in the negotiation. You lost the deal. You pointed out the problem in the meeting. You became the inconvenience of the weak. You were loyal when everyone else was jumping ship. You were the first one cut when the ship steadied. You did what was right, at a real, concrete, measurable cost, and you watched in slow motion as whoever did the opposite reaped exactly the result you expected to be yours. And now you are sitting with a feeling that is not quite anger. Anger would be cleaner. It is something quieter, more corrosive than anger. It is the suspicion, the one you try to push away, the one that comes back with nocturnal persistence, that maybe you are the naive one in the story, that maybe goodness, integrity, the persistent attempt to act with some coherence in a world that seems to value none of it, is a miscalculation, a life design error you have not yet had the courage to name to yourself. As if the world operated on a different grammar than the one you learned, and you are still trying to communicate in a language nobody uses seriously anymore. This video is not going to tell you the world is wrong and you are right. That would be self-help. And self-help is not what happens here. What will happen is different. You will see the mechanism operating beneath that confusion, and after seeing it, you will not be able to pretend you did not. This is not weakness. It is not naivety. It is not an excess of idealism or a deficit of real-world experience. It is a real, structural tension that affects a specific number of people, those who have not yet completely abandoned the idea that there is a right way to act, who have not fully subscribed to cynicism as a way of life, who still carry somewhere inside, protected, sometimes ashamed to be seen, the conviction that integrity matters, even when the world around them offers consistent evidence to the contrary. You see colleagues who distort numbers and get promoted. You see people who manipulate relationships and build enviable networks of influence. You read about executives who commit fraud and then receive consulting contracts after the scandal. You observe behaviors that you yourself recognize as unethical, being packaged into business frameworks as high-performance strategies, into books as advanced social intelligence, into courses as how people who deliver results actually operate. And you're left with that specific feeling that the measuring stick was swapped out while you were not looking. Or worse, that maybe the measuring stick was never what you thought it was. That maybe you were the only one who took it seriously enough for it to cost you something. Moral confusion does not begin with the grand philosophical dilemma. It begins with the small ones, the everyday ones, the ones that do not even seem like dilemmas while they are happening. You are in a meeting. The manager presents data that is just slightly distorted, so that the quarter's results look better than they actually were. You know, you can see the numbers. 3 people in the room know 2. Nobody says a word. The presentation continues. Everyone nods, as if confirming something legitimate. You leave with that metallic taste in your mouth, not exactly from having done something wrong, more from having failed to do something right, and from not having enough clarity, not full certainty, about whether the difference still truly matters. Or you are in a conversation with a friend who is building a distorted narrative around a situation. The distortion benefits him. It hurts someone who is not present to give their version. You know the story has deliberate gaps, but speaking up would cost you the friendship or a conflict you do not want right now. So you nod along or stay in strategic silence, which in that context is the same thing as agreeing, or you are weighing a professional decision. The most profitable option carries a cost that shows up on no balance sheet. Someone will be hurt. Not illegally, not in a way that can be litigated, but in a way that you, in a moment of clarity without pressure, would recognize as wrong. You think about it for a moment, then you think about the outcome, then you stop thinking about the cost. Each of these situations, in isolation, seems small. It is not a crime, it is not a betrayal of historical scale. It is simply life working the way life apparently works for everyone who has gotten somewhere. But what happens cumulatively is this. Every small concession moves the line 1 millimeter. The line of what you consider acceptable. The line of what counts as necessary pragmatism versus what counts as dishonesty. And you accept each redefinition with a more palatable name. Maturity. Understanding how the world really works. Learning to play the game without losing your essence, until one day you try to remember what the essence was, and you realize you no longer know for certain what it was. Moral confusion does not explode. It seeps in homeopathic doses of pragmatism, strategic silence, and reasonable concessions. And by the time you notice the accumulation, you are already so deep inside the process that you no longer know exactly when you cross the line, because the line was moving right along with you. So the question you could never quite formulate with enough precision to truly examine it: if goodness seems naive, if integrity has a real and documented cost, if the world appears to structurally reward the opposite of what you were taught to value, where exactly is the error? In you, for insisting on a measuring stick the world does not validate. In the world, for failing to create the conditions under which virtue would also be the smart strategy. Or somewhere in a third place you have not yet examined. 1,900 years ago, a man dealt with this tension, not in the abstract, not in a school of philosophy, in the most concrete and brutal situation possible, governing the largest empire of his era, surrounded by every imaginable reason to abandon any attempt at principled conduct. And what he left on record, not for the public, not for posterity, but for himself as an exercise in interior survival, will completely shift the angle you are using to see what is happening to you. Marcus Aurelius was born in 121 AD. He grew up under Stoic influence, a philosophy that, in those days, was not the subject of motivational quotes or office decor. It was a system of mental training for facing reality as it is, not as you would need it to be in order to keep functioning. At 40 years old, he became emperor, the most powerful man in the known world, and he governed for 19 years under a pressure that is hard to imagine without grounding it in specifics. Simultaneous wars on multiple frontiers of the empire, a plague that decimated entire cities, including people close to him, internal conspiracies orchestrated by people he himself had promoted, senators who betrayed him in public with the smile of someone paying tribute, generals who defied orders, and an entire court where political survival routinely required exactly the kind of moral flexibility he refused to practice. He did not write a book of philosophy. He did not write to be read. He wrote a diary for himself, probably with the conviction that it would be destroyed after his death, as was customary with private writings. That diary survived, for reasons historians still debate, and it is called the Meditations. It is not a treatise. It is a collection of reminders that a man writes for himself so as not to lose the thread of who he decided to be, while the world does everything to unravel that thread. In an environment that offered daily and sophisticated justifications for corruption, he wrote to himself as a form of resistance. Not resistance to the world, resistance to the tendency to let the world shape him without his noticing. The question that the Meditations leaves behind is not how to be good. It is something more precise and more uncomfortable. Why do you still think the world has anything to do with it? There is an assumption at the center of your moral confusion. It runs so deep that you have probably never examined it directly because it does not feel like an assumption. It feels like simply the way things are. It feels like the obvious starting point for anyone who thinks seriously about ethics. The assumption is this: for goodness to work, the world needs to cooperate. You believe, without knowing you believe it, that integrity is viable when the environment supports it, that the values you carry need a minimally favorable external ecosystem in order to sustain themselves, that being good in a world that rewards the opposite is, fundamentally, a project doomed to wear you down. This does not feel like a philosophical assumption. It feels like common sense. It feels like the kind of conclusion that people who have learned from experience arrive at, and that idealists without enough experience have not yet grasped, until you examine what that logic produces when applied consistently. It outsources your ethics to context. It transforms your moral compass, that supposedly internal navigation instrument, into a thermometer. A thermometer does not define temperature. It measures it. It adapts to the environment. When the environment changes, the thermometer changes with it, automatically, without resistance, without deliberation. What this produces is not intelligent adaptability. It is the absence of a consistent moral self. You do not have values. You have reactions to the dominant values of whatever environment you happen to be in. Marcus Aurelius diagnosed this with a precision that has not aged. He called it dependence on externals, the tendency, universal, human, understandable, to seek out there the criterion for what can only be genuinely judged in here. And the Stoic diagnosis is not vague. This dependence is not a consequence of moral confusion. It is the cause. The world does not leave you confused because it is chaotic. It leaves you confused because you turn the chaos into the referee. Rome in the 2nd century was not a city of philosophers in serene squares. It was a structure of institutionalized violence, slavery as the economic foundation, endemic corruption among the elites, and a political system in which assassination was a legitimate instrument of governance. Marcus Aurelius governed all of that. And the Meditations are not a lament about the state of the world. They are a daily, repetitive, almost stubborn exercise in inner discipline. Because he understood, and needed to keep repeating it to himself over the course of years, that the external chaos is not the problem. The problem is using the external chaos as an argument for abandoning inner coherence, as if the disorder out there justified disorder in here, as if the absence of a collective compass were reason enough for you to drop yours as well. You did not choose your values in a genuine act of deliberation. You inherited reactions to your environment. When the context rewards honesty, you are honest. When it rewards strategic ambiguity, you hesitate. When it celebrates sophisticated dissimulation, you begin, slowly, to rationalize it under more presentable names. Your morality does not function like a compass pointing toward a fixed north. It functions like a mirror, reflecting what surrounds it. Marcus Aurelius watched this happen in the Roman court every single day. Senators who were principled when being principled was advantageous, who became flexible when flexibility was required, who built an entire public identity around virtue and discarded it the moment the cost of maintaining it exceeded the benefit of appearing to have it. He wrote about this mechanism without naming specific individuals, not because he was being delicate, because the phenomenon was not about those particular people. It was about the structure, about what happens when virtue is treated as a strategy rather than as a choice. Virtue that depends on favorable circumstances is not virtue. It is convenience with a good reputation. And at some level of honesty with yourself, you know how to tell the two apart, even if you sometimes find it useful to confuse them. Every time you let a small dishonesty slide, yours or someone else's around you, something happened that you did not calculate in the moment. You did not merely tolerate that specific act. You moved the line of what you consider acceptable, imperceptibly, 1 millimeter, without drama, without any visible rupture, without any signal that something important was being altered. The line does not disappear all at once. It shifts so gradually that you can never identify the exact moment you crossed some point of no return. One day you look back and can no longer clearly recognize who you were before you started conceding, not because you became a bad person. That would be too dramatic a reading of what is, in fact, a far more subtle process. But because the standard kept being redefined through an accumulation of contexts, and you kept accepting each redefinition under a reasonable name: maturity, pragmatism, understanding how the world actually works. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations daily, in part for exactly this reason. The diary was not literature, it was an audit, a way of verifying every single day whether who he was being still corresponded to who he had decided to be. A conscious resistance to the erosion that the environment by its very nature promotes. Deep moral confusion is not the state of not knowing what is right. It is the state in which you have lost your reference point for what you yourself once believed, because you gave ground so many times for long enough that the starting point has become inaccessible. You want to act with integrity, and you also want that to be recognized, for people to see it, for the environment to validate it, for the result to prove somehow that the right choice was also the smart choice, that there was a coherence between what is good and what works. These two desires seem complementary. In practice, they are fundamentally opposed. When you act with integrity while expecting external recognition, even if you do not admit to yourself that you are expecting it, your conduct has become dependent on the perception of others, and others' perception is exactly the first thing that chaos dismantles. The chaotic world does not distribute recognition based on moral merit. It distributes attention based on visibility, power, narrative ability, and timing. With a frequency too high to be accidental, the most dishonest person tells the most convincing story because they do not carry the additional cost of needing the story to be true. Marcus Aurelius was direct in one of the most unsettling passages of the Meditations. He did not expect Rome to recognize his conduct. He expected of himself that the conduct be carried out, regardless of audience, regardless of outcome, regardless of whether anyone was watching or whether being watched would produce approval. This decoupling of virtue from approval is the hardest point to sustain. It is where most people abandon the attempt, arguing that acting rightly without reward is naive altruism, a form of giving without receiving, a bet no rational person would make. What Marcus Aurelius discovered, testing this over 19 years of maximum pressure, is that external approval does not sustain conduct over the long term. It weakens it, because the moment approval is withdrawn, the conduct that depended on it collapses along with it. The only stable foundation of virtue is internal. It always was. The pursuit of approval is not a supplement to virtue. It is a substitute for it. The diagnosis, however, has a second layer. Because the moral confusion you experience is not only the result of where you seek your criterion, it is actively fed by dynamics that have a concrete interest in keeping you confused. Think about the difference between two types of people in any high-pressure environment. The first has no clarity about what she values. She is permanently in doubt about what is right in that specific situation, in that specific context, with those specific variables. She consults the environment. She waits for signals. She is, as a consequence, highly responsive to the pressures around her. The second has a clear internal hierarchy, not dogmatic rigidity, clarity. He knows what he will not do, even when the context offers sophisticated justifications. He does not need to consult the environment to know where his north is. He can be influenced, persuaded, convinced, but within a defined field that does not collapse under pressure. Which of these people is more manageable? Which of them can be moved by whoever controls the signals in the environment? Moral confusion is not merely a personal malaise. It is a state of structural vulnerability, and it is sustained, not necessarily consciously, but in a systemically effective way, by the constant public negotiation of what is right. Morality has become a real-time debate in which every ethical position is contested before it is even examined, in which any assertion about what is wrong is immediately followed by qualifications that contextualize, historicize, complexify, and in the process dissolve, not the specific wrong position, but any position that requires firmness. The result is predictable. You have learned to distrust your own moral convictions before you even express them. You think, who am I to say what is right? The world is complex. Every situation is different. There are no absolute rights and wrongs. This feels like intellectual sophistication. It feels like the opposite of fundamentalism. It feels like honesty with the real complexity of things. But what it produces is exactly the state of compasslessness that suits whoever wants you navigating without your own north. You permanently consulting external signals, never arriving at a position firm enough to resist the next pressure, always open to being repositioned by whoever controls the argument of the moment. Marcus Aurelius lived this. The Roman court was an environment of highly sophisticated moral relativism. There was always an intelligent advisor who explained why that specific rule did not apply to that specific context, why that particular principle needed flexibility at that precise moment, why moral rigidity was, in truth, political naivety that would cost dearly. And he would write to himself in variations that recur throughout the Meditations, "It is not my role to straighten out the world. It is to not let the world twist me." That distinction is not a small one. It completely changes the project. Here is the mechanism you had not yet named, with enough precision to see it operating. The mistake is not trying to be good. The mistake is trying to be good for the world. This sounds like wordplay. It is not. These are two fundamentally distinct projects with fundamentally distinct consequences. Trying to be good for the world means your goodness is an offering, and you expect, at some level, for the world to accept it, for the environment to recognize it, for the outcome to validate the choice, for the external chaos somehow to make an exception for whoever tries to act with integrity within it. This is a transaction, a bet in which the other side of the table, the world, is unaware that any agreement exists and therefore will not honor it. Every bet creates dependence on the outcome, and when the outcome does not arrive, the bet looks like a mistake. Trying to be good without the compliment is an entirely different category of project. It is a structure of inner coherence that makes no offering to the world and expects no response. It is not a performance for an audience. It is not a long-term reputation strategy. It is not an investment waiting for a deferred return. It is the repeated, daily decision to maintain an internal hierarchy of values, regardless of whether this produces a favorable, neutral, or actively unfavorable external result. The Stoics called this autarky, not self-sufficiency in the sense of isolation, but in the sense of being one's own criterion, of not needing the environment to be aligned for conduct to sustain itself. Marcus Aurelius identified what he called the fundamental divide, that which is under your control, your judgments, your choices, your deliberate responses, and that which is not, the behavior of others, the way the world distributes rewards, the outcome of your actions in the external environment. And all moral confusion, all of it, without exception, comes from expecting what is not under your control to cooperate with what you have decided inside. The chaotic world will not stop being chaotic in order to accommodate your attempt to be principled. It never did. There is no historical record of a period in which the world cooperated with virtue consistently enough for virtue to be able to depend on that cooperation. Marcus Aurelius knew this. He governed for 19 years, knowing this. And that is precisely why the Meditations exist, so that he would not need the world to change in order to remain who he had decided to be. You are not confused because the world is chaotic. You are confused because you are still waiting for the world to stop being chaotic so that your compass can function. And a compass, if it is truly a compass, does not work that way. It never did. What works that way is a thermometer. You were not trying to be good. You were trying to be good in a way the world could confirm, that the environment would validate, that the outcome would prove, retroactively, that the right choice was also the profitable one, morally, socially, professionally. and the world, which signed no such agreement with anyone, which does not distribute validation based on internal merit, simply did not deliver the confirmation. And that then appeared to be evidence that the attempt to be good was the mistake. It was not. The mistake was the structure of the attempt. Marcus Aurelius spent 19 years in the most powerful position in the known world, surrounded by every possible reason for corruption, the pressure of war, political necessity, constant betrayal, real exhaustion, and the Meditations document that he maintained a coherence that time did not undo. Not because the world cooperated, not because virtue was rewarded sufficiently to justify it as a strategy, but because he stopped asking the world to be the referee of his conduct. The confusion you carry is not a character flaw. It is the logical and predictable consequence of having placed the compass in the wrong place, of having sought out there the criterion for what can only be generated and maintained in here. With this reading, the scenarios of your daily life begin to yield a different diagnosis. The meeting where you let the data distortions slide was not a dilemma between integrity and professional survival. It was a moment in which you consulted the environment, what the other people in the room were doing, what the immediate cost of speaking up would be, what the collective silence was signaling, and obeyed what the environment signaled. It was not cowardice. It was dependence on externals operating automatically without you noticing you were consulting the thermometer instead of the compass. The frustration of watching the dishonest person prosper is not evidence that goodness does not work. It is evidence that you are still measuring the validity of goodness by the results it produces in the external world. Marcus Aurelius would say something precise here. What the dishonest person gains or loses is not a data point about the validity of honesty. It is simply a data point about how the world distributes resources, and the world has always done that in a way that moral merit neither explains nor predicts. The suspicion that you might be the naive one is not a sign that you should abandon integrity. It is a sign that you are still waiting for integrity to be validated from the outside. And it will not be, not reliably, not consistently, not with enough frequency for you to use that validation as a foundation. The naive one is not the person who maintains values in a chaotic world. The naive one is the person who keeps expecting, with renewed sincerity at each new attempt, for the chaotic world to validate whoever maintains values. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations so as not to lose the thread, so as not to wake up, after years of small concessions, to the inevitable pragmatism of power, unable to recognize the person he had decided to be, unable to trace the line between who he was and who he had become. He knew the chaos would not stop, that Rome was not going to straighten itself out, that the traitors would keep betraying, that the corrupt would keep prospering, that the world was not going to pause in order to reward whoever tried to be principled within it. And he kept writing, even so, every day, as an act of inner resistance against the erosion that the environment promotes without your needing to give it conscious permission. The question that remains is not about the world. The world will keep being what it is. The question is about where you will seek your criterion when the pressure to concede arrives, and it will arrive with good justifications, with reasonable arguments, with the weight of everyone around you doing otherwise. And that is not a question the world answers for you. It has an answer you build or do not build through the choice of where you look when the line is about to move one more millimeter. If your goodness depends on the world making sense, what is left of it now? Marcus Aurelius did not offer a solution. He offered a diagnosis and a practice, that of returning every day to the internal criterion, not because it produces external reward, not because it guarantees an outcome, but because it is the only navigational instrument available that does not collapse when the environment changes its grammar. That is not comforting, it is structural. If this diagnosis shifted something in the way you read your own moral confusion, subscribe to Antidote Philosophy. What we offer here is not a solution, it is vision, the disturbance of seeing the mechanism, the productive discomfort of no longer being able to pretend with complete honesty that you did not see it.